My name is Bill Wimsatt, Bill Wimsatt. I'm stationed at Beale Air Force Base, just north of Sacramento in California, and I'm here with the 99 Reconnaissance Squadron here in Southwest Asia. Today, what I did in the mobile was basically back up the pilot. The mobile is the U-2 pilot's wingman, so basically he relies on the mobile to help him with takeoff and with recovery for the landing. For the takeoff, the pilot wears a large pressure suit, so you can imagine wearing large ski gloves and a big suit, trying to climb into a cockpit with small switches and trying to get it all set up yourself, meanwhile having your body overloaded with some extra thermal loading from the heat, since the suit obviously doesn't breathe. So my job as the mobile is to go out there before the pilot gets to the aircraft, set everything up so that all he has to do is just sit down and start engines and go. For the recovery, if you see the pictures of the U-2, you can see that the canopy, there's not a lot of visibility outside the cockpit, and so the U-2 pilot relies on his mobile for landing to help call out altitude in relation to the runway as he comes into land, and that helps the pilot or backs him up for landing. The chase car has to be able to obviously keep up with the U-2 while it's taking off or landing. So it needs to be a vehicle with some speed and a little bit of maneuverability so that it can make the sharp turns onto the runway. For the takeoff, the pilot is relying on the mobile to watch his pogos, which are the extra landing gear in the wings. If a pogo should stick, then my job as I'm chasing him down the runway for takeoff is to call out, hey, raise your left or raise your right, and that gives him a heads up that, hey, one of my gear is sticking, and he can pop the wing up real quick and let that, hopefully, pogo fall out, and then he'll be clear for the rest of his departure. For the recovery, same thing. He basically needs a chase car with the speed and agility to make the corner onto the runway, and then stay usually within about 50 feet of the aircraft for landing, so that the mobile pilot can look out the window and see his altitude as he comes into land. Oh yeah, we definitely get training. There's a whole syllabus. We actually take a check ride in the car to get checked out in the as a mobile. Like I said before, the mobile is the U-2 pilot's wingman, so the only chase car drivers are U-2 pilots, and both are trained both to operate the airplane and the chase car. It's definitely a unique mission. Most aircraft don't need a whole entourage to follow the jet out onto the runway for takeoff, or same for landing. I believe that the chase car is probably very unique to the U-2. As we were sitting there and we buttoned up the pilot, we pulled out the howdah, which is our name for the stairs that the pilot walks up to get into the aircraft. Once he's all buttoned up, my job is to run back to the car, double check the radios, give him a thumbs up and a radio call saying that he's good to go. I would drive out as the ground crew gets all squared away. He calls for taxi. I do a last double check to make sure that there's nothing hanging from the jet that's not supposed to be. And once everything's in the green, I give him an all clear call. At that point, he gives a signal to the crew chief, and the crew chief starts waving him to taxi. And that's when we saw him taxi out there today. As he passes by, I give him a thumbs up that everything's looking good and nothing's leaking or nothing looks out of place. Like I said before, the visibility out of the cockpit is very low, so once again, we're backing up there on the taxi. And then really, I'm just following the aircraft and watching the wings and the whole aircraft to make sure that we don't knock anything over. On some airfields, the taxiways are quite narrow, and if you're not careful, then those pogos can knock over taxi lights and what have you. Here in Southwest Asia, then we got pretty wide taxiways, and it's not as much of an issue here, but sometimes it's hard to make the turn in the U-2 because the tail wheel only casts her 6 degrees left or right, and as a result, you really have to lead those turns when it comes to turning the airplane. You'll be coming up on a taxiway while you're taxiing the jet, and you'll put in a full boot of rudder to turn that tail wheel, and it's just a slow, gradual turn until you make it onto the next taxiway. So it's really planning ahead, and then if you get in trouble, your mobile will call you and tell you to stop, and at that point sometimes requires a pushback, which we kind of lose cool points for, so you don't want to have that happen. Once we got out on the runway and he was cleared for takeoff, you noticed that I drove in front of the aircraft, and out on the runway I did a final FOD check, making sure everything's clear from the runway. I turned around, I saw that his landing light was off. That was telling me that everything was good. And then as I passed by his right window, he flashed me 3 fingers saying that his 3 pins were pulled and stowed, and that's the last check for that. And then you saw all the pogo crew running around and checking the jet. They're still checking to make sure no hydraulic leaks, everything's in the right place. I'm doing the same thing, driving around the aircraft, making sure everything looks right. And then once the pogo crew pulls away and they've got all the pins pulled, specifically for the pogos, because those won't fall out unless you pull their pins. Once everything's all good to go, I'll give him a thumbs up. He gives me a thumbs up. I give him a salute, and then I back up the car and wait for him to put up the throttle for departure. And like I said before, once he starts rolling, so do I, and I got to stay right up with him, not only to guard on the pogos, but if he was to flame out and lose his engine on takeoff and he had enough runway in front of him, then I'd be right there behind him to make calls so that he could land, just like we do every day. It's daunting sometimes, but it feels good when the mission is done well and you know that you are a part of it. The day in, day out of it, just like anything, it seems like to the outside observer that it's very odd and a lot of the procedures are unique, but once you've done it every day, you kind of get used to it, and then it's pretty much old hat and you're used to it. But it still feels good to, whenever you know that you launched that jet that day, and then likewise when you come back, that the mission was a success. We know that that pilot is going up into a dangerous, high-altitude environment, where he's going to be subjected to the body's reaction to essentially standing on Mount Everest. He's going to be cramped up in a aircraft that he can't stand up in. He's going to be eating tube food. He's going to be experiencing the expansion of nitrogen in his bloodstream, bubbling, and that's an uncomfortable thing. And I know that as the pilot, when I step out there, if I can make everything perfect in the switchology and the checklist for his departure, then it just makes his job doing our ISR mission that much easier. Well, obviously the best thing about being a chase car driver is the speed and chasing aircraft down the runway, which is not common in our Air Force, most Air Force aircraft today.